Gemara and Sukkah Daf Hey. All the learning for this month, the month of Av, has been generously sponsored by Eastern Union, L'Zchos Zecher Nishmas, Yecheskel Shraga ben Avram Yehuda, as well as Rechel Bas Shamshan Aaron Tzvi. Their neshamish have an aliyah, the Zchos of all the incredible Torah being learned, should be a Zchos Lila Nishmasam. Of course, all our Chidim and Mevega Chaim and Sarah Shalom Sivan Rezil Sar Bas Kanendli to Basim As Chaysar Yisol Mendel the first Israeli Shamas Nami Vishavigu Shechan Shmuel with the Yildin Chan Rezil Mikul Chay Bas Min Librachot of Musa Din Edom Bashim Min Tzvi Mevega Mechel Sun Selahu Rivka Bas Sheva. Naftali Siv Mechles the Succah Chali Yisrael as well as Chashirach for Yisrael Chaim and Devaira and at the Leah Bas Ita. We're holding on the very bottom of Daladam and Beis. We're really 5 lines from the bottom at the 2 dots. But let's do a quick chazara of a lot of this Amid Beis, which we went through a little bit fast yesterday. And hopefully if we speak it out outside and we speak out the pictures one more time, it will give a lot of clarity. So yesterday, and if anyone's looking inside the Gemaras you'd like to see, we're speaking out right now about 11 lines down. The Gemara started, Tanara Bana Not Arba Kondisim. The Gemara spoke about a case that you put, and we'll do this with pictures, and here you see is that you put 4, you made like a chuppah, you put 4 pegs, and you put Succah on top of it. And the Gemara had a discussion whether this is going to be kosher sukkah or not, and where exactly is this machlekes was part of the discussion. So the Gemara said, first the Gemara wanted to say that the machlekes is Rav Yaakov and the Chachamim, kosher or apostle, and Rav Huna said the machlekes is like the picture you just saw, only on the edge of the roof. But if it's in the middle of the roof, there's no machlekes. And the simple reason is because you have the edge of the roof, you have good asik. I also want to correct myself, Shkayach Rav Yossi, I kept on saying good achis. It's good asik. Good achis is when the walls go down. Good asik is when the walls go up. So says Rav Huna, the machlekes is only when the poles are on the edge of the house, because then you can say good asik, the walls can go up high. But when the sukkah is in the center of the roof, then you cannot say good asik, because then it's in the middle of the roof, and therefore says Rav Huna, there is no machlekes in that case. The Gemara proved that can't be true, as the Gemara quoted a brisa that was discussing Daled Kadisim Ba'aretz, and in that case it also quoted a machlekes Rav Yaakov and the Chachamim. And you see very clearly that they're arguing even in a case when it's not on the edge of the roof. So the Gemara said Tiyufta de Rav Huna. Now the Gemara went on to explain what exactly is the reason why it could be kosher if it's in the middle of the roof, and we quoted a brisa. If you're not Arba Kadisim Ba'aretz V'sikich Al Gabam, Rav Yaakov said, review Yachiku v'Yachliku v'Yesh Bem Tefach. Rav Yaakov, who's the opinion who says it's going to be kosher, we view it as if you chisel it out. We'll explain that in one moment. And the Chachamim said, no, it's possible. Why? Because you have Shtayim Kol Chas and Rishishis Afilu Tefach. Of course, that statement of the Chachamim is something very important and crucial, because that statement of the Chachamim is the Halach L'Maisa, that you need to have 2 full walls and a third of Tefach. But this is how Rav Yaakov is going to learn that when you have these 4 poles and you have Succah on top of them, even in the middle of the street, smack in the middle of the roof, there's no good asik. The walls cannot go straight up off the walls of the house. So how could it work? The way it could work is because we take this cylindrical pillar, you take this circle and you shave it down and you make it into a square. You make it into a right corner. If you have a right corner, a tefach on either side, then Rav Yaakov says it's going to work. And the reason is, like this case of Pasi Birois, like you see in front of you, they had a well and there was a special kula that they made, that if they make these corner pieces around the well, it's an am on each side, it's going to work. And similarly, over here is going to be the case of Rav Yaakov. That's how it's going to be a kosher sukkah, and that is the basic explanation of where we ended off yesterday. Now we pick up over here. Says the Gemara 6 lines to the bottom. If it's not 10 tefachim tall, and this was the discussion the past 2-3 days. A sukkah's maximum height is 20 amos according to the Chachamim. Rav Yehuda disagrees, and the sukkah's minimum height is 10 tefachim. But says the Gemara today, Minalan, where do we know that the minimum height is 10 tefachim? And that's really going to be today's discussion. 20 amos was yesterday, today is 10 tefachim. Minimum height of a sukkah. What is the source for this din? Says the Gemara, Itma Rebbe Rav Chanina Rav Yechon Rav Chaviva Masnu Bekulu Seder Ma'it. They learned as follows: Kol ki haizuga chalufa Rav Yechon umayla Rav Yenasan. So first of all, the Gemara says we have this whole list of Amarayim, Rav Chanina, Rav Yechon, Rav Chaviva. So first the Gemara says, in Mayid, the Gemara points out, no, you got to switch Rav Yechon for Rav Yenasan. Okay, now that we get the name straight, says the Gemara, what's the teaching? Arayin Tisha v'Kapayres Tefach. The Arayin in the Beis HaMikdash was 9 tefachim tall, and the Kapayres, the cover on the Arayin, was 1 tefach thick. Harei Kanasar, that's 10 tefachim. Uksif, and the Torah teaches us. And it's there that I have a meeting with you. V'dibarti itcha, and I'm going to speak with you, says Hashem. Me'al hakap ayres. From the top of the kap ayres, as we turn over to today's daf, hey Amid Aleph. So far we just learned that the Aron is 9 Tfachim, the Kapiris is 1 Tefach on top of the Aron. Says the Gemara Vitania, and we learned in a Braisa. Rabbi Yosi Aimer says, Rabbi Yosi Me'ilam lo yardu shchina lamata v'lo alu Moshe v'Eliyahu lamaroim. The Shechina never descended all the way down to earth, and Moshe and Eliyahu Hanavi never ascended all the way to Shamayim. How do I know that? Says Rabbi Yosi Shenamar, the Torah teaches us, Hashamayim Shamayim Hashem. The heavens are for God, and the land is for man. Says the Gemara, and therefore the proof is going to be that the Shechina never came all the way down to earth. So where did the Shechina come? Because it says, Hashem says, I'm going to speak to you, Moshe Rabbeinu, from on top of the Aron. So how far did Hashem go down? Seemingly he went down till the top of the Aron, meaning till 10 Tfachim. And therefore, that's what we're going to see, that 10 Tfachim is the minimum height of a Rishus. Because the Rishus, the domain, we could call it, of man, is the land. And that's till 10 Tfachim. The domain of God is above 10 Tfachim. And that's going to be the source that the Sukkah's minimum height is 10 Tfachim, because the minimum size of a wall is 10 Tfachim. How do we know that? Because Hashem never descended all the way down low. Therefore, must be Hashem hit the top of the Aron and the Pareichas, and therefore only 10 Tfachim. Before we continue, let's just see a picture over here. This is, everyone knows what the Aron and the Kapiris looks like, just to get clarity. Here's the Aron, and the Kapiris is the thick, tefach-like cover with the keruvim on top of them, which we'll talk about more in a few moments. Asks the Gemara 4 lines down, are the Shechina lamata? Is it true the Shechina never came all the way down to earth? Well, the Pasuk said here, Hashem al Har Sinai. Hashem came down to Har Sinai. Answers the Gemara, no. He wasn't all the way on the mountain, he was above 10 Tfachim. But the Pasuk says, and he stood his feet on that day, Al-Har Hazesim, on Har Hazesim, seemingly proving that it went all the way onto the mountain. Again, so now we see that Hashem never actually came all the way to earth. There was always this 10 tefach gap, which is the makar and the source that the wall of a sukkah, minimum height is 10 tefachim, as we see the minimum domain is 10 tefachim. Asks the Gemara, fine, now let's go the other way. You're telling me Moshe and Eliyahu Navi never went all the way up to the heavens? The Pasuk says, Moshe went up to Hashem. Seemingly he went to heaven. Answers the Gemara, he didn't go all the way up, he was 10 below. Again, Eliyahu went up. Again, the same answer. The Gemara continues the third question. Says the Pasuk that he was grasping on ma'achis, he was holding Pnei HaKisei, the throne, he was holding on to the Kisei HaKavod. Parts of our love and honor, which the clouds were on top of it. Amar Rav Tanchum, and Rav Tanchum explains, Melamed Shapira Shakai Meziv Shchinasai. This shows us that Hashem himself spread out his radiance of his Shechina, V'ananei alav, and his ananim, and the clouds were upon Moshe. So it sounds like from the pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu is holding the Kisei HaKavod, and Hashem is letting his glory, whatever this means in physical sense, we don't know. But the Shechina is going down into Moshe Rabbeinu. So it seems very clear Moshe Rabbeinu was all the way up in heaven. Answers the Gemara, no, again, Lamata Me'asara. 3 questions, same answer each time. Moshe Rabbeinu never went all the way up. Ask the Gemara 1 second. It says that Moshe was holding on to the Kisei HaKavod, the throne of Hashem. So how could it be he wasn't all the way up? Answers the Gemara, it's true he was holding the Kisei HaKavod, but the Kisei HaKavod came down. It wasn't all the way up in heaven, it came down within 10 Tfachim, and that is where Moshe Rabbeinu grabbed hold to it. So 2 times we asked how if Hashem really didn't descend, and each time we answered Hashem was within 10 Tfachim on top of the land. And 4 times we asked Moshe Rabbeinu Eliyahu didn't ascend, and each time we answered there was a 10 tefach gap, and Moshe wasn't all the way up. So now, so is the Gemara. Let's go back to the Aron. We said the Aron was 9 tefachim, the Kapiris was 1 tefach. Hashem came and spoke at top of the Aron, showing that the domain, the Rishus of Hashem, goes until 10 tefachim. Minimum Rishus of a Sukkah is 10 tefachim. Asks the Gemara, Bish Lama Aron Tisha. The fact that the Aron itself is 9 tefachim, I understand the Torah says, V'asu Aron asei shitim amasayim arkoi. It says that the Aron of shitim wood should be 2 amasayim v'chetzi arko, 2.5 amas its length, v'ama v'chetzi rachbai, and 1.5 amas the width, v'ama v'chetzi kamasai, and 1.5 amas its height. and an amma is 6 tfachim. 6.5, half of 6 is 3. 6 and 3 is 9. So we see that the Aron was 9 tfachim. Anyone who is together with us back in the Eruvin days remembers that is a big machlek. It's the size of a tefach. Size of an amma. Is an amma 6 tfachim or 5 tfachim? The Gemara here is clearly assuming it is 6 tfachim. And at the end of today, in the bottom of Amud Beis, the Gemara is going to ask this exact question and wonder what about the other opinion that holds it was really a 5 tefach amma, which if you do the math, it's only going to be 8.5 tefachim tall, the Aron. But right now the Gemara is happy, 7.5, excuse me. Right now the Gemara is happy saying the Aron is 9 tefachim tall. Why? 1.5 amos, 6 and 3, 9 tefachim tall. But says the Gemara, great, that's the Aron. But El Kapayra is tefach manalan. How do we know that the Kapayra is the cover of the Aron was 1 tefach? Zani Rav Chanina kolak kilim shasam Moshe nasna bahen Torah midas arkan midas rachman. All the kilim Moshe Rabbeinu made, the Torah gave us the length and the width. Umidas kamasan and their height. Kapayres, when it came to the cover of the Aron, midas arka umidas rachman nasna. The Torah taught us the length and the width. Midas kamasan nasna. The Torah never taught us how thick is the covering of the Aron. So says Rav Chanina, you know, I'm going to show you how thick it's going to be. Say v'lama mi pachay shevikelim. So Torah doesn't tell us how thick. So I'll tell you, let's go learn from the smallest of all the kelim. Shenamar, as the pasuk says, miskeres tefach, and you should make a miskeres, a border around the Aron of a tefach, saviv, around the shulchan, of a tefach. So malal and tefach, avkan tefach. Says the Gemara, great. Just like we see that the shulchan had a crown around it, which we'll see a picture of this in a moment, which is 1 tefach tall, 1 tefach thick, so too the cover of the kapayris, says Rav Chanina, because the Torah doesn't say the specific thickness of the kapayris, so prove it from the shulchan. But ask the Gemara on the last narrow line, maybe we should learn it from the kelim itself, meaning the misgeres, the crown, is an accessory, it's a sidebar, it's not the actual keli. So how do you know to learn from there? Maybe you learn from the actual keli, the smallest keli in the base of the Mishkan, which is going to be larger. Answers the Gemara, tafasta maruba loy tafasta, which is a rule we're going to see again and again over here, that any time we're unsure whether we should learn from a larger measurement or a smaller measurement, tafasta maruba, we always grab onto the smallest measurement. We don't go with the larger one, tafasta muat, tafasta. Ask the Gemara on the first white line, mitzitz. So let's turn now for the tzitz. The time we learned in the Brayse that tzitz daimekim tas. The tzitz was a sort of gold plate, shells of gold. V'racha beis its voice, and it was 2 fingers thick. Umuka me'oizoi, went from ear to ear of the kohen gadol because of love beishitin, and it was written on in 2 lines. Yod hey l'maylo, yod and hey above, v'kadosh l'mala and kadosh below, v'kadosh lamid l'mata. Ve'omar Rav Elazar Rav Yosini re'isi b'roimi, I saw the tzitz, the holy tzitz of the kohen gadol because of love kodesh Hashem b'shita achas. Rav Elazar Rav Yosini says, no, it wasn't 2 lines, it was 1 line. So ask the Gemara, maybe the thickness should be 2 fingers thick like the tzitz, and not 1 tefach like the cover of the shulchan, like the misgares, like the crown. Answers the Gemara, done in keli mi keli, being done in keli mi tachshit. The tzitz was a tachshit, it was a piece of jewelry, it was an ornament for the kohen gadol. So we rather learn from a keli itself. Ask the Gemara, great. The nail of mizer. Let's learn from the zer, from the crown of the Aron and the shulchan. I just realized that we made a slight blunder. We have to go back 1 moment. Pardon everyone. Let's go back for 1 second. And the Gemara said 3 lines from the wide lines. 3 lines before the wide lines. What did the Gemara say? And all those that were sitting and screaming at your computer screens or your phones, however you're watching and listening, I apologize. The Gemara said misgeres tefach. When the Gemara said miskeres tefach, I translate that as a crown. That was an absolute incorrect statement. The miskeres was not a crown, it was a border around it. Now is where the Gemara is asking about the crown of the shulchan, which we're going to see in the picture in a moment. But before we are learning out that with regard to the shulchan, you're making a border of 1 tefach around it. That is not what we're talking about right now. Now we're talking about what I said before, which is the crown. Apologies, let's go further. When we see the picture, hopefully it will clear up any issues. Ask the Gemara 5 lines into the wide lines, v'neil of mizer. Let's learn from the crown. The Amar Mar Zer Mashu. The crown was a mashu, was a little bit. That wasn't a keli itself. That was a hechsher keli. Ask the Gemara. The Gemara says the mistake that we just made. They're very similar. Miskares now the hechsher keli. 1 second. The miskares, the border around the shulchan, was as well only a hechsher keli. Was as well only an accessory to beautify the shulchan. Answers the Gemara. Who miskarte lemata? Excuse me. Nami hechsher keli. Who? Answers the Gemara. Misgarte lemata isa. The miskares, the border was below, and therefore, since the actual shulchan was on top of it, therefore it doesn't have a din of a hechsher of an accessory, but rather as a din of an actual part of the shulchan. It's a machlekes isa. 4 lines from the bottom. According to the opinion that holds the miskares was on top, was part of the top part of the shulchan. Michael and Meimar answers the Gemara, Hi hechsher kliyu. So it's still only a hechsher. So how are you learning from the miskares? Eladonin davar shenas l'bayteira mida, midavar shenas l'bayteira mida. By the tzitz and the zer, the Torah itself did not give the measurement, and therefore that is not going to be the source. Rather, we're going to learn from the miskares, from the border around, because that is a source given by the Torah itself. That is the first raya, how tall the kapayres of the Aron is going to be. Here we see the picture of the kapayres. Here we see the beautiful tzitz. As you see, Kodesh Yud Kei Vav Kei on the top, Kodesh Lashem on the bottom, 2 machlekes shitas over here. Exactly how it was written. And this is the second of Eliezer, and he saw in Rome, was all on one line. Here you see the misgares was the border around, and then you have the zer, which is the crown on top of it. So here you see in the 2 opinions, this is the opinion that the misgares was part of the bottom part of the base of the shulchan, and then the shulchan itself sat on it. Therefore, the misgares has a din, has a status of the shulchan itself. Again, the misgares that you see over there is 1 tefach thick. The other opinion held the miskares is part of the top part, therefore has a din of a hechsher keli, and therefore it says the Gemara, it is not going to be a good source, but rather the reason is we're going to learn from the miskares because it's explicit in the Torah. Rav Huna Amar Me'acha says Rav Huna, I'll tell you where we learn it out from. A new source. Al Bnei HaKabayres Keinma. It says that you should sprinkle the blood on the eastern side of the kapayres. Ve'ein panim bachos mitavach. And the word panim, pinei kapayres. The word pinei, panim, a face, is always a tavach. Says Rav Huna, second source, we learn from the kapayres itself. But how do you know? Because it calls it a pinei, it calls it a face. Ask the Gemara 1 second. Ve'ema ka'ape, as we turn over Tam and Beis. Va'ape ka'ape tvar yoichni. May we learn it out from a tremendous bird, which has a larger than a tavach face. Tavas meruba loy tavasta. Tavasta muba tavasta. Again, if we have a choice which way to go, we go with the smaller measurement. Says the Zutar Tfei. So if you want to go small, learn from the smallest bird, which is less than a tefach. It's very small. Amar Ravach Bar Yaakov, Ravuna Pnei Gomer. He has Xer Shav. Ksiva by the Aroy now Pnei Akapayus. Uksiva Asam Me'es Pnei Yitzchak Aviv. So we see it's the Pnei like Yitzchak Aviv. Just like by a person's face is about a tefach. So too, when it comes to the kapayres, it's going to be tefach about the size of the face. So to the kapayres is going to be a tefach. Ask the Gemara 1 second. Maybe we should learn how to face like Lamaila, like the beings above. The Chsev, as the Pasuk teaches, like the face of a divine being, like the face of a Malach. The Gemara is assuming that a Malach's face is larger than a human being's face. Answers the Gemara the same teretz. This is, I think, time number 3. So ask the Gemara, wait, the Kruv had faces. So why don't we learn now from the Kruv itself? That it should be like the face of the Kruvim, and we know that the Kruvim were not as tall as human beings. They were about half the size of a human being, and therefore we're assuming that their faces were half the size. The Kruvim were about 10 tfachim tall, as we'll see in a few moments. So we're assuming that their faces were smaller. So maybe that Pinei we should learn from, teaching us that the Kapayris is smaller than a tefach. Amar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, Gemiri ein Pinei Kruvim chuzim mitefach. Even though they were short, their faces were the regular size of people's faces at a tefach. And this is really where Ravuna itself learned from. Says the Gemara, a little bit of a sidebar, my krov, where does this word come from? Ravua karvya shekein bebavel currently nuka ravya. It's a child, a kravya. In Bavel they call a child a ravya, that's the word krov, like a child. Amar le Abaye. Now Abaye asks, so far we just said the second source of Ravuna is Pnei, the face, and the face of a person is a tefach, just like the face of the kruvim was a tefach. Elameata asks Abaye, Dechsev b'nei echad, b'nei akruv, b'nei hasheni, b'nei adam. Hainu krov, hainu adam. Says Abaye, I don't understand. The pasuk says Pnei echad is Pnei krov, b'nei hasheni, b'nei adam. One was a krov, one was an adam. But based on what we just said, the krov and the adam were the same faces. But the pasuk sounds like they were two different faces. Answers the Gemara, Abe Ravi, Abe Zotri. Says the Gemara, really it does mean like a child's face, but it says Kurov for like the Pnei Adam, because it's a little bit of a larger face, not like the smaller face of a child. So it's not a small face, but the larger face of a human being. Says the Gemara. Okay, until now we had two sources. Either it was from the Aron, or it was from the Aron. It was number one. The Pareichas was number two, and Pareichas is number three. Two different ways about the Pareichas. Says the Gemara. 1 second. All the sources we had was that it was 10 tefachim tall. But I asked the Gemara 1 second. Let me clarify that. It was all from the Aron. Then we had two sources how to learn that the Pareichas was the Kapairis. Was 1 tefach thick. Says the Gemara. Great. So the Aron with the Kapairis was 10 tefachim. But how do you know that the airspace underneath of the sukkah has to be 10 tefachim? Maybe it's 10 tefachim with the schach. Maybe it's 10 tefachim including the schach. Says the Gemara, totally new source. So until today, the first 21 minutes of today, we've been discussing that the source for the minimum size of sukkah is from the Aron. Two ways of learning that the kapayres was a tefach. Says the Gemara right now, no. Because you don't know. Maybe then the schach should be included. So new source, Elam, Beis Elam, Gamar. We learn from the Beis Hamikdash Dechsev. The Beis Hamikdash is 60 amayis long, Vesrim Rachba 20 wide. Ushleishim Amakai Masa and 30 tall. Uksev, and the pasuk says, so it was 30 amayis tall, the roof, and the kruv was 10 amayis. Vitanya, and the Brisa that teaches us, just like we find in the Beis Hamikdash, Kuruvim Bishlesh Abayisim, they were 20 amayis, the Kruvim were 10 amayis and the ceiling was 30 amayis. So the Kruvim were a third of the height of the Beis Hamikdash. In the Mishkan they were also a third. So the Beis Hamikdash was a 30 amma tall ceiling, and the Kruvim were 10 amayis, a third. So too in the Mishkan. So how tall was the Mishkan? Mishkan kamehave eser amayis. So Mishkan was 10 amayis. Tersev as amayis oirech hakeresh. 10 amayis were each keresh, each plank of the Mishkan. Kamehavilahu. So how big is 10 amayis? Says the Gemara, Shitin Pushchi. That is 60 tefachim, like we just explained before. That each amma seemingly is 6 tefachim. So the height of the Mishkan is 10 amayis, 60 tefachim. So how much is a third of 60 tefachim? Esrim Pushchi, 20 tefachim. So now we know that the Kruvim were 20 tefachim tall in the Mishkan. They were 10 amayis tall in the Beis Hamikdash because the ceiling was 30 amayis. In the Mishkan, the ceiling was 60 tefachim, 10 amayis. So therefore the Kruvim were 20 tefachim. 20 tefachim, including the Aron they were on top of. So take off the 10 on the bottom of the Aron. V'kapayres and the kapayres were 10 together. Pashalu asara. So the Aron and the kapayres was 10 tefachim. The Kruvim were another 10 tefachim on top of that. And that's how we know, because that's 20 tefachim, which is a third of the 60 tefachim of the entire Mishkan. So now what does that do for us? Uksiv, and the pasuk says, V'hayu akruvim parshik and afayim, and the Kruvim were spread out their hands, l'may l'bav. Soichechim, such a crucial word. They covered, they sheltered with their wings. Ala kapairis. Says the Gemara, you know what the source is, and this is the new source. Kari rachman s'chacha l'may l'may asara. He used the word s'chacha, sheltering, schach. when it's above 10 tefachim. So again, let's get this clear. The Mishkan was 60 tefachim, 10 amos. The Kruvim are a third of that, 20 tefachim, on top of a 10 tefach arein and kapayres, meaning the Kruvim were 10 tefachim tall, and it says that their wings were sheltering below. How does it shelter below? So we see sheltering is 10 tefachim. Says the Gemara, beautiful. But Mimai, how do you know the Gadfinu Eloi Reishayu Kaimo? How do you know that their hands were above their heads and therefore 10 tefachim underneath? Dilma Lahadi Reishayu Kaimo. Maybe their hands were equal with their heads, and therefore the airspace underneath was less than 10 tefachim. The whole reason we got into this new Makar was because we were trying to find the Makar showing us that the Succah itself had to be leaving an airspace of 10 tefachim. But says the Gemara, how do you know? Maybe the wings were equal with the heads, and therefore the airspace again is less than 10 tefachim. Amar Abacha Bar Yaakov L'Malik Seif says their hands were above. Says the Gemara, great. Maybe it's very high above, so maybe it's 30 tefachim. It doesn't say it's 2 lamalas above. Rather, it says lamala, and therefore that's how we know it's going to be 10 tefachim. Before we go a little bit further, here's a beautiful picture as you see that the Kruvim were 10 tefachim on top of the kapayros, on top of the aron, and that's how we learned out the source that seichachin, sheltering, is going to be 10 tefachim. And we'll conclude with the final Gemara that says, like we spoke out the whole day, all the amos were beinunais, meaning 6 tefachim, all the math works out beautiful. When you build, you use a 6 tefachim, that's great. But the kelim are only 5 tefachim. Now your math is all messed up. Why? How tall is the Aron and the Kapairis now? It's 8.5, like we spoke out on Amud Aleph. Because you have an Amma and a half, an Amma is 5, a half an Amma is 2.5, is 7.5 tefachim plus the tefach of the Kapairis. So the Aron is only 8.5 tefachim. Pashalu, so how much is left? The Keruvim are up till 20. 20 minus 8.5, Pashalu Chatzri Palga is 11.5. Ema Sukkah Adav Chatzri Palga. Maybe the Sukkah is allowed to be 11.5 tefachim tall. Says the Gemara, Elo Rav Yehuda Helchsek and Mirila. According to Rav Yehuda, that learns that the Kalim in the Beis HaMikdash were by 5 tefach amos, and therefore when you do the math, the Kruvim are 20 tefachim tall, minus the 8.5 tefachim of the Aron and the Kapayros, you're left with 11.5 tefachim. According to Rav Yehuda, the Lach L'Moshe Misinai, Dam Rav Chibar Rashi Amar Rav, Shir L'Chatzis Mechitzin Allah L'Moshe Misinai, which we're going to pick up from here tomorrow. But we're ending off with the Makar. The one Makar that stands the test of time is the fact that it says with the Kruvim, their hands are sheltering Succah. That's the way to remember it. So with the Makar is from the Keruvim at the end of the day. We started off trying to learn from the Aron. The Aron 9 plus the one of the Kapayros, 2 different ways of learning how the Kapayros was going to be 1 tefach. But at the end of the day is we didn't have a reason to show us that the airspace had to be 10. Maybe it was 10 including the Succah. So we went to the second Makar that it says that the Keruvim, their wings were Lamaila, not Lamaila. But Lamaila were above, and therefore showing us that the height of the Mishkan was 60 tefachim. A third of that is 20 tefachim. Like we see in the Beis HaMikdash, it was a third, 10 of 30 amos. And therefore it's going to be that the Seichachin is going to shelter underneath an area of 10 tefachim, but according to Rav Yehuda, that we use 5 tefachim amos, then it's Allah Moshe Sinai. We'll pick up from here.